hundreds of lives, thousands of lives, millions of lives, and it was data that was collected cautiously, carefully, repeated, because he knew what a storm it would unleash on the industry and on society in general. And we're honoured that we could bring Tim in the place in here to talk about this, and we'll head over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira. Thanks everyone for dialing in. Thank you for coming. It's so exciting to be actually in a room with a little bit of physical distance and plenty of ventilation with people, not only people, but the best kind of people, journalists. So thank you so much for coming. So I want to talk about how we can, I could say I want to talk about how we can think more clearly about statistics, but actually I've never really been about thinking more clearly about statistics. I want to think more clearly, full stop, and statistics, I think, are a way to do that. But I wanted to start by doing something slightly different, which was to read just a couple of pages from my book. This is from chapter 1. And well, you'll see, there may not be quite as many numbers as you would expect. Abraham Radius was nobody's fool, an art critic and collector who is the world's leading scholar on Dutch painters, particularly the 17th century master, Johannes Vermeer. As a young man in the 1880s, Radius had made his name by spotting works wrongly credited to Vermeer. At the age of 82, in 1937, he was enjoying something of a retirement swan song. He had just published a highly respected book in which he had identified 200 fakes or imitations of Rembrandt. It was at this moment in Radius's life that a charming lawyer named Gerard Boon paid a visit to his Monaco villa. Boon wanted to ask Radius's opinion of a newly rediscovered work, Christ at Emmaus. Thought to have been painted by Vermeer himself. The exacting old man was spellbound. He sent Boon away with his verdict. Emmaus was not only a Vermeer, it was the Dutch master's finest work. We have here, I'm inclined to say, the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft, wrote Radius in a magazine article shortly after. Quite different from all his other paintings, and yet every inch of Vermeer. When this masterpiece was shown to me, I had difficulty controlling my emotion, he added, noting reverently that the work was engrais, Dutch for virginally pure and untouched. It was an ironic choice of words. Emmaus could hardly have been more corrupt. It was a rotten fraud of a painting, stiffly applied to an old canvas just a few months before Radius caught sight of it and hardened with Bakelite. If you look at this painting as presumably like me, somebody who is not like Abraham Radius, one of the world's leading experts on Vermeer, there's something slightly odd about it. You may not be able to put your finger on it, but let me just show you a picture by Johannes Vermeer. That's what a Vermeer looks like. That's a masterpiece, woman reading a letter. You see the soft light, the beautiful way that Vermeer has caught just the details on this chair, and just the drama of this moment of stillness. Is she pregnant? Maybe it's slightly ambiguous. What's in the letter? She's catching her breath. It's a magnificent painting. And this, well, not only is it not that good, it doesn't really look like anything Vermeer ever painted. So how is it that you can show this painting to the world's leading authority on Vermeer, and he comes away making a fool of himself, writing that this is Vermeer's greatest work? Well, the answer is the forger who painted this work understood something very deep about human nature, which is that sometimes we want to be fooled. And that's why I begin the first chapter of my book with a story that is absolutely nothing to do with statistics. Because what we place our trust in, what we think is true, what we think is a lie, it goes much deeper than technical details about statistics and correlation and causation and mean variance ratios and all this sort of stuff. I could teach you all the technical knowledge I have, which is not that much, but it's some. You could get the technical knowledge from some of the world's great statisticians, epidemiologists, people as great as Sir Richard Dole, and you could still make mistakes, like Abraham Radius made mistakes. If you want to believe something enough, you'll believe it. If you want to disbelieve something enough, you'll disbelieve it, even though it may well be true. So, I mean, fundamentally, the issue for Abraham Radius is this great critic in his, right at the twilight of his life, had come up with quite a fond theory that he had about Vermeer. Vermeer's a mysterious figure. We don't know that much about him. He didn't paint many paintings, at least not many that survive. There's a big gap in his career between his early paintings and his late paintings. And Radius had this idea that maybe Vermeer had gone to Italy and had been influenced by the Italian masters, and in particular had been influenced by Caravaggio. And that perhaps he had painted some religious paintings, because his early paintings are religious and his late paintings are not. And so Radius had this whole story he told himself and told other people about Vermeer, that there was no way to know whether this was true. So the forger who painted this painting painted a painting that was inspired by Caravaggio. It's a Caravaggio sort of composition. They're standing around like a Caravaggio painting. He put all kinds of details in it that a really great expert like Radius would recognize. So, for instance, that jug, that's a proper jug from Vermeer's era, and the forger owned this jug and he painted the jug. The way this bread is painted, it's very much like the bread in The Milkmaid, which is a famous painting by Vermeer. The colour palette, if you look at the colour palette, and he got that right, as much as possible he was using the pigments that Vermeer was using. And he painted the whole thing on a 17th century canvas. So he scraped off the original painting, which was just some rubbish, and repainted over it. And all of these things you or I wouldn't be able to see, but Abraham Radius could see. And because he was such an expert, all of this was accumulating as evidence. The only problem was that the one piece of evidence that counted against the idea that this is a Vermeer is the most obvious piece of evidence, which is that this painting doesn't look like anything Vermeer painted ever in his life. It's just rubbish. But if you want to believe enough, you'll make yourself believe. And Gerard Boone, the lawyer, wasn't showing Abraham Radius a painting. He was showing Abraham Radius proof that the thing he'd wanted to believe all along was true. He was showing him vindication. So, the first thing that I want to emphasize is that thinking clearly about statistics really means the same sort of habits of mind as thinking clearly about anything else, which means keeping an open mind, which means not falling into the trap of wishful thinking, which means asking the right questions, being skeptical, but not too skeptical, not cynical, not just dismissing everything out of hand. I think these are habits of mind that make for a good journalist. Being a good journalist and being a good statistical journalist and being a good statistician are not perhaps quite as different as we might think. So that's, I think, the first thing that's very important to emphasize. The second is that we, I think, underestimate the power of wishful thinking. So there's a lovely little study done of this by an economist behavioural economist here in Oxford called Guy Mayraz. And what he did was he just asked people in his experimental group to make forecasts of wheat prices. He showed them these graphs and he said, these graphs show wheat prices. They didn't, they were actually just pulled out of I think they were the Dow Jones, they were pulled out of the stock market. He showed them these graphs. He said, oh, here's a graph of wheat prices. Now I want you to make a forecast of where wheat prices are going to go. And if your forecast is accurate, I'm going to give you some money. But he also divided the experimental subjects into two groups. So some were in the baker group, and the bakers, they got extra money if wheat prices were low, because bakers need to buy wheat. And then the other group were the farmers, and the farmers got extra money if wheat prices were high. So you're showing people these graphs, you're asking them to make a forecast, and you're saying, I'll pay you for two things. I'll pay you if wheat prices happen to turn out low if you're a baker, high if you're a farmer. I'll also pay you if you make an accurate forecast. But it turns out that people's forecasts were distinctly swayed by what they hoped would be true. So the farmers forecast high wheat prices and the bakers forecast low wheat prices, which is what they wanted to happen all along. Even though there's absolutely nothing in them to do this, the incentive was to just get the forecast right. Just a simple, elegant illustration of wishful thinking. Now, you might think, you might hope, okay, but once you get really good at forecasting, once you get really good at anything, as Abraham Radius was really good at art critiques and was really good at identifying fakes, once you get good at that kind of thing, you're not going to be fooled as often. You won't make as many mistakes. It's not clear that that's true. So let's think about, a couple of examples. One is just observational evidence. If you look at surveys of the American public on what they think about climate change and whether they think climate change is a big problem, you'll see that Republicans and Democrats are quite far apart. Democrats think it's a big problem, Republicans don't think it's a big problem. Okay, fine, there's no surprise there. But then compare less educated Republicans to less educated Democrats versus more educated Republicans to more educated Democrats. What do you think would happen? And you may have seen some of these graphs, you may be aware of this research, but you would assume, like, if you're more educated, you're going to be closer together, right? Because this is a factual matter. We're always gathering more information about climate change. The science continues to evolve, and we don't know the truth, the precise truth. But whatever the truth is, you would think people would be more likely to converge towards the best theory the more education they have. That's the opposite of what's happening. The more educated Republicans are further apart from more educated Democrats than less educated Republicans and Democrats, who are actually quite close together. They're like, oh, we don't know about climate change, whatever. But well-educated Republicans are really convinced there's no problem. And well-educated Democrats absolutely convinced there's a huge problem. So that tells you, straight off, facts aren't enough. Education isn't enough. The same thing, by the way, it's not just education, so scientific literacy. You can measure scientific literacy. Does not help. Same thing. Increased polarization. Okay, so what's driving that? How could that possibly be true? Well, remember Abraham Radius. He saw all kinds of stuff in what the forger had produced here. He saw all kinds of little pieces of evidence that he could seize on, even though actually that evidence was leading him to the wrong conclusion. And more generally, the more you know, the more cognitive tools you have in order to reach the conclusion that you want to reach. I think it was Molière who said, I'll find the Molière quote because I'm just going to get it wrong. Both Molière and Ben Franklin basically made a similar point about this. Yes, Molière, a learned fool is more foolish than an ignorant one. And Benjamin Franklin, so convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables us to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to. So the more you know, the more you can fool yourself. That's what you want to do. So we understand a little bit about how this process works. So there's a classic study of this by two political scientists, Charles Tabor and Milton Lodge. So Tabor and Lodge got people to pass for certain arguments, certain political arguments on hot button issues. And as you might expect, if you're trying to make arguments or evaluate arguments that are contrary to what you believe, people struggle with that. They find that more difficult. They're able to marshal more arguments in favour of things they already believe. But what they found was that people who were already expert were much better at just very quickly dismissing arguments they didn't want from the other side, and much better in digging up all kinds of spurious reasons to believe what they wanted to believe. This process is sometimes called biased assimilation. Biased assimilation. And the biased assimilation is basically the more information I give you, the more information you have to selectively pick from. You can ignore the stuff you don't want to ignore. You pay attention to the stuff you want to pay attention to. And so there are certain experiments where I give you more facts, I give you more evidence, and rather than you would think, oh, well, that will pull people closer together. If I give people more unbiased information, they're going to get closer and closer together. Not necessarily. On political hot button issues, you pull people further and further apart because they each have more and more cherry-picked information to reach their conclusions. So everything I'm saying here is really building towards this, this overarching point. But when we observe a statistical claim about the world, the very first thing we should do is to say, how do I feel about this? What is my emotional reaction to what I've just been told? Am I thinking, yes, I knew it? Am I thinking, oh yeah, my side's right? Am I feeling denial? Does it make me feel insecure? Oh, there's this person that I politically supported, and now there's this claim that he or she's done something bad. You know, well, that sounds like fake news to me. Oh, the person I oppose, some claim that he or she's done something bad. Well, of course, yes. What would you expect? Now, I'm not saying you can completely overcome your emotional reaction. I don't think we want to overcome emotional reactions. Emotions are important. Feelings are important. But I do think at least we should be noticing them before we rush to hit the retweet button or the like button or whatever, or rush to cover the story, or rush to dismiss the story because, yeah, okay, that's obviously nonsense. So noticing that emotional reaction, I think, is a really important habit of mind and an important defence. And I've tried to do this more myself. Of course, it's impossible to completely overcome your emotional reactions, but to just try to be more calm. So an example I remember a few years ago, I saw on Twitter a graph, I think from the Washington Post, showing support for gay marriage was dramatically increasing in the US. And for me, that's good news. And I was really pleased to see it. And so I just clicked retweet, just share the good news. This is great. More and more people are entering the modern world. And then the very first reply was, Tim, have you looked at the axes on that graph? And I just thought, oh no. And I looked, and yeah, the axes were really dodgy. The Washington Post, I don't know what they were thinking really. But for me, it was enough that it was like, oh, Washington Post, good news, boom, retweet, that's enough. And I should have clipped that graph for my bad data visualization files. Because when I show people really rubbish graphs, so I should put this graph up there, and this is not a good graph. But I didn't, I just shared. So I think I do that less often. There was a recent review of my radio show that said, I think Tim Harford has been chemically altered to just have all the emotion drained out of him. He seems very calm about things that he maybe shouldn't be calm about. But I mean, for me, that's, I think that's a compliment. At least I'm going to take it as a compliment, because being calm helps us think more clearly. Now, flipped around, as journalists, this is a real challenge, right? Because we know what gets clicks, we know what gets shared. It's the stuff that produces an emotional reaction. Laughter, tears, anger, that's the stuff that gets the retweets. It is you do occasionally, and I find this encouraging, you do occasionally, for example, on Twitter, see a really, really good explainer, a really good thread, that really just picks something apart and shows how it all sort of fits together. Sometimes those things go viral, but much more it's just the primal howls of rage that go viral. And of course, we're under pressure as journalists to produce journalism that people read. That means headlines that get people excited. And you can see today's persuaders, you know, from Donald Trump to Extinction Rebellion. Like, when was the last time either Donald Trump or Extinction Rebellion, who I think probably disagree about absolutely everything, when was the last time either of them tweeted anything to make you pause and calmly reflect? Oh, yes, that is interesting and complex. That's not how it works. You know, they want you to hurry up and feel something. So it's a fine line to walk as a journalist, to really explain the facts, to really help people understand the world, and at the same time to get any kind of attention. It's tricky. I'd love to tell you that I've solved the problem, but I haven't solved the problem. I think it's really hard. You can tell people stories that engage their interest and curiosity and get people willing to work harder to understand. And that's a possible way forward. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to also just share something that I recently did that I think is instructive on this whole thing, which is I made a mistake. And I think it's an intriguing journalistic mistake, and it's one that I'm really embarrassed about. So, but I understand that here at the Royal Institute for the Study of Journalism, the Summer School, it's partly about group therapy, isn't it? It's partly about journalists getting together to talk about their troubles. So, okay, so right, I feel like I should be lying on the couch now and staring at the ceiling. So here's what I did. About 3 weeks ago, a friend of mine emailed and said, look, actually, we're on the phone at first. He said, Tim, I just want to know, I want like a guide to life in the COVID age. I want to understand what my risks are if I go out to the gym. I want to understand how dangerous it is to get on the London Underground. He's in his early 60s. He lives in London. So, you know, early 60s, he feels like he's in a high-risk group. London Underground's a pretty crowded place. No, he just wanted help. So I did the maths. And so I went to the Office for National Statistics, which has a survey of the whole population every week in England and Wales, and they estimate the prevalence of the virus each week. And that survey is really useful because it's representative. It's not like the case count, which is very influenced by how many tests, where the tests are, etc., etc. You know, this is, although it's a smaller survey, it gives you much better data. That is, by the way, a technical insight that I discuss in the book. But so I looked at the survey, and the survey said, okay, the prevalence is 44 incidents, 44 cases per million people per day. Okay, it's changed a bit. I mean, there'll be more data. I think in about 35 minutes. But recently it's come down a little bit from there. So we'll see what the latest data says. 44 million infections 44 infections per million people per day. Okay. So from that we can say, obviously everyone's behaving differently, everyone has a different risk of catching the virus, but let's say you behave like everybody else is behaving on average. And I don't really know what that is, and neither do you. Okay, this is what we can do. You got a 44 in a million chance of catching the virus every day. What's your chance of dying if you catch the virus? Well, there's some pretty good data on that now. And for a 62-year-old man, white, no other health conditions, it's about 1%. So then you get to around, okay, so there's about a 1 in 2 million chance every day that he will catch a fatal case of the virus. Okay, so far so good. So far I'm sending this to statisticians I know, epidemiologists, they're checking all the maths. They're like, well, you're making some assumptions there, and yet, but basically you're right. Then here comes the mistake. I say, okay, 1 in 2 million. what else is like a 1 in 2 million chance? It turns out this is the kind of thing that statisticians do write about. And there are a couple of good articles about it written by good people. Skiing, riding a horse, motorbike, taking a bath. I put those in the piece. But I don't check all that. I just put them in because, like, you know, I just, you know, grabbed it. That's not a big deal. That's not what I'm really doing, right? And the FT, where I published the piece, put in the subhead, right now, coronavirus is as dangerous as taking a bath. And I thought, oh, okay, whatever. Okay, I'm busy. Actually, I was on holiday, but I was doing this book launch. Turns out book launch is time-consuming. 3 days later, The Sun, which is one of the most read tabloid newspapers in the country, published a headline that said, "Expert says coronavirus is as dangerous as taking a bath." Ooh, okay. I thought that was okay for like the third from last paragraph in a column in just like a list of stuff, but now it's the headline in The Sun. Then the Mirror said, "Expert gives interview to Sun saying coronavirus," which maybe they should have checked that one. So the Mirror report the story. Then the Daily Mail want me to write a piece for them. And of course there's politics behind all of this, because all of these people are trying to say, just get back to the office, okay, this is not a big deal, right? And I have some sympathy with get back to the office. Don't have any sympathy with it's not a big deal. But you know, okay, it's complicated. So I write this piece for the Daily Mail, and they sort of spin it and they nudge it, but basically it's what they do is totally fair. Within the, you know, they're pulling in a certain direction, I understand that. And then they call me and they say, we're going to go with, expert says coronavirus is as dangerous as taking a bath. And I'm sitting there and I tell my wife, I'm like, Daily Mail is going with the headline. And she says, will you just check it, okay? Oh yes, I could check it. I could just check it. It's not too late. So I go and I check it and I'm wrong. Of course I'm wrong. So I call the Daily Mail and they change the headline. They're not happy, but they do change the headline. Newspapers are still reporting expert says coronavirus is as dangerous as taking a bath. So what do I learn from that? One thing is that, you know, people are going to say what they want to say. People are going to emphasize what they want to emphasize. But it was a really interesting insight into the filter that we go through as journalists, and we need to be very aware of. So it's one thing to make a mistake just way down, that's not the main focus of the article. It's not great. I'm not proud of the mistake. I wish I hadn't made the mistake. But it's very interesting that the mistake got into the subhead. Why did the mistake get into that subhead? Well, because the mistake was really interesting. Why was it really interesting? Because it's wrong. Like a lot of the things that we report on as journalists, we report on because they're surprising. They might be surprising because they're new. You know, that's why it's called news and newspapers. They might also be surprising because they're just wrong. Okay, it's a really powerful filter. I mean, I really push strongly against the cynicism that says you should never believe what you read in the newspapers. And one of the very first things I say in the book, even before we get to Abraham Radius and this art forgery, is pushes against the cynicism and says, look, statistics help us understand the truth. But you know, there is certainly some room for cynicism because of the interestingness filter. The interestingness filter doesn't just apply to newspaper headlines, it applies to the choice of stories, it applies to academia. False results get published in academia simply because the results that are wrong are more interesting than the results that are right. The results that are right tend to be kind of, oh yeah, well, we knew that all along. So that's why that wrong claim got into the FT subheadline and then got into the Sun headline and the Mirror headline and then the Daily Mail, fortunately, because they've got their politics, but they're honest, they didn't put it in the headline, but they wanted it in the headline. They put something as close as they could possibly get into the headline. So there you go. That is the biggest mistake I think I've ever made. It's certainly the most famous thing I've ever written. It's the best known piece of journalism I've ever done. The most eyeballs, the most attention, and it's wrong. Okay? So I feel bad about that. It's my fault. I'm not blaming any of these other people, it's my fault. But we really need to understand that process going on. You may be interested as to how I made the mistake. So the source I looked at was also wrong. And the mistake that the source I looked at made confused the risk of taking a bath with the risk of dying in the bath each year. So the risk of dying in the bath each year is about 1 in 3 million, which is about the same as the risk my friend is running of dying from coronavirus every day he goes outside his door. But I wouldn't advocate comparing a risk each day to a risk each year. That's not very good. So yeah, my fault. Should have checked. But there's this filter sort of in operation. I want to sort of take some questions and you know, share other ideas from the book, anything you're interested in. But I also wanted to let you know the end of this story. I think that in itself is interesting. So the forgery was not discovered until the end of the war, and it was discovered in a very strange way. So when Abraham Radius saw this, it was 1937. It was 2 years before the Second World War broke out in Europe. And so the whole war raged. People had a lot more important things to worry about than art forgery. And then in May 1945, the war in Europe had come to an end. Two officers from the Allied forces knocked on the door of an art dealer called Han van Meegeren, who lived in a beautiful townhouse in the middle of Amsterdam. And they said, there's a bit of a problem, Mr. van Meegeren, because we just found Hermann Goering's treasure trove of looted art. And it's got a Johannes Vermeer painting in it. And the Germans, being Germans, kept the receipts. And it says they got it from you. And that's treason. You sold a Vermeer to the Nazis. So you're going to hang if that's proved. And they took him in for interrogation, and after a while, he basically snapped. And he said, "You fools, you really think I sold a Vermeer to the Nazis? I painted it myself. That's not a Vermeer, it's a Van Meegeren." And this became just a sensation. This discovery that this plucky little art forger was a sort of Robin Hood figure who, you know, not only did he not sell priceless Dutch treasures to the Nazis, he ripped off the Nazis. There's this story that Hermann Goering was sitting awaiting trial at Nuremberg, and he was told what Van Meegeren had done to him and how Van Meegeren had ripped him off. And he was, the look on his face, it was like he'd realized for the first time that there was true evil in the world. It's great. Isn't that a wonderful story? It's a wonderful story. It's not true. Sorry. Not true. So everyone tells a story about Goering, but there's no evidence that ever happened. Everyone loves the idea that Van Meegeren ripped off the Nazis. But Van Meegeren was an anti-Semite. If he wasn't a Nazi, he spent an awful lot of time palling around with the Nazis. And when the folk of Amsterdam were starving during the war, Van Meegeren was holding lavish parties at his mansion, surrounded by jewels and prostitutes draped with jewels. He produced a really luxurious book called Tekeningen, full of anti-Semitic poetry and full of anti-Semitic illustrations by Van Meegeren. And a copy of that book was found in Adolf Hitler's library with a personal dedication to my beloved Führer, yours, Han van Meegeren. Okay, so the great story about the plucky forger who fooled the Nazis, it's like this, same thing. You wanted to believe it, I wanted to believe it, everyone wants to believe it. the guy was a real, I'll spare you what I think of him. He's a horrible man. But he went to trial for forgery. And it was, the trial was this sensation. And everyone was super excited. But and he had to do this ridiculous stuff, like he had to paint a fake Vermeer to prove that he had painted the fake Vermeer that fooled Hermann Goering. And it was something that was shattering for the Dutch art scene, but for the Dutch public, they were like, at last, because there were so many collaborators. Anne Frank wasn't the only person to be betrayed by the Dutch and to be sent to extermination camps. There's a lot of that happened during the war. And the Dutch were fed up of this narrative they had of themselves as people who had collaborated. They wanted new heroes. They wanted to believe something different about themselves after the war, and I understand that. So they were looking for heroic figures. They didn't want another Nazi. And Van Meegeren gave them what they wanted, just as he gave Abraham Radius what he wanted. And by the time the trial of Van Meegeren was over, he was a national hero. And you might think, oh, if only they had found the anti-Semitic book in Hitler's library dedicated by Van Meegeren, if only they'd found that in time, they would have known the truth. But they had that all along. No one cared. He just said, oh, that's not my signature. Someone else must have. Or like, I signed a load of books, somebody else must have written the dedication. It's a ridiculous excuse. If it had been the modern world, he would have said, that's not my voice on the tape. That's what he would have said. And people who wanted to believe it would have believed it. He died shortly after the trial was over, before he went to prison, and there was an opinion poll that said that apart from the Dutch Prime Minister, he was the most popular man in the country. We believe what we want to believe. I'm really happy to take questions about journalism, statistics, art history, my mistakes, anything you like. But I understand we're going to take the questions in the room rather than on Zoom. So everyone who's been watching on Zoom, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Buy the book. Book's out next week. And thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks so much, Tim.